Well, hello and good morning. Happy Sunday, everybody. Welcome to our virtual Sunday school class. We've got a good one for you today. I know I say that all the time, but this one really is good. It's really it's such a true lesson that really does apply to our lives today. It applies in our church life, in our home life, in our spiritual life, wherever we may be. It's something that really is so true. We're going to be in Jonah chapter 4. It's too bad we only spend just 2 Sundays in the book of Jonah here in our book, because it really is a great story all throughout. It's a wonderful piece of history. This one in particular, we're going to look at the very last chapter in Jonah. And overall, the whole book of Jonah is really kind of a very interesting, somber story. There's a lot of ups to it, and there's a lot of downs to it. We looked at some of that last week in our Sunday school lesson, and we'll dive into that in just a moment. But this particular lesson in general, in this section of Jonah, talks about the lack of compassion that God's people can have. And when you think about that, it's kind of a contradictory statement. You know, God's people, God's chosen people, Christian men and women, not having compassion for other people. I mean, yeah, that's something that just doesn't go together. But believe it or not, we see that more and more in our society today, and even more so in our churches today. And so we're going to be looking at that in just a moment. But when we're talking about a lack of compassion, I want you to think about some sports rivalries. For those of you that are big into baseball, I mean, we've started postseason baseball. The playoffs are here. The Cardinals are in. You know, I would love to see St. Louis go and play Atlanta in the division series, and of course the Cardinals would obviously win. We know that they're the better team. But when you think about good old sports rivalries, one that comes to mind, especially in our household or in our family, I'm a big Cardinals fan. You know, we grew up about an hour from St. Louis. My brother, on the other hand, I've always known that there was something different about him because he's a Chicago Cubs fan. I don't know if he was neglected as a child. I don't think so. But for some reason, he chose to be a Cubs fan. And in the world of baseball, the Cardinals and Cubs, it's a rivalry. I mean, it's a very historic rivalry. It's a clash. You know, when it comes to the home run situation with Aaron Judge recently, you know, you think back to 1998 when it was Mark McGwire with the St. Louis Cardinals and Sammy Sosa with the Chicago Cubs, who were battling back and forth to see who could beat Roger Maris's record of 61 home runs in a single season. And of course, it was the St. Louis Cardinals player, Mark McGwire, who beat that record. So it's always an interesting clash when those things go on. We love to see, as Cardinal fans, we love to see the Cubs get beat up on by whomever it is. It's like I root for 2 teams, the Cardinals and whoever plays the Chicago Cubs. And then let me tell you something. When you all go to a NASCAR race, if you've ever been or if you've ever watched it on TV, if you're a true diehard fan like me, there is one driver that everyone just loves to hate. And who is it? Kyle Busch, driver of the number 18 Toyota. Everybody, I should say not everybody, but nearly everybody, when he's announced at the races, you know, Brady and I went to Darlington back in September on Labor Day weekend, and when he's announced to the crowd at the very beginning, just a flood of boos just rain out of the stands. I mean, just so overwhelming. He is definitely one of the most disliked drivers. And when he wrecks, you know, everybody first makes sure he's okay. But when the car hits the wall or he blows a tire or blows an engine, in this case, at the race we were at, what does the crowd do? They go crazy. They cheer. They go happy. Why? Because they love to hate him. And it's an interesting phenomena to see how people react to that. But it's also very interesting in our Sunday school lesson to see that there are times where God's people love to hate. And there's a very specific message from God that says it's not okay to act that way. That's not the way we should be living. And we're going to look at Jonah's case in just a moment. But he was one, he loved to hate what happened or what God had even done. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that in just a moment. But when you think about today in general, are there people in your life who you just cannot tolerate. People who maybe are so against what you believe in, or maybe you see people that you don't even know, whether it be a celebrity, a politician, an influencer, someone, on one of those social media apps, the Facegram, Instabook, or the TikTok clock thing, whatever you call those, whatever you kids are using these days. You see those influencers out there who are so anti-Christian, so anti-God. And sometimes you wonder, or sometimes you may have this thought, because I've thought it, you have this thought of, I can't wait to see what happens to you on Judgment Day. And you know what? That's a very dangerous thought. It's an awful thought, one that shouldn't be thought, but it's a place where we've all found ourselves. And we're going to take a look now in Jonah chapter 4. And just to give you a brief background, Jonah, in the first chapter, he was called to go and preach to Nineveh. Go and preach to the king, go and preach to the people, a very wicked people, the capital city of Assyria at the time, one of the three biggest cities in the whole country at the time. They hated the people of Israel. They hated the Jewish people. They hated all the Israelites. And even from the days way back into the days of the patriarchs, they were constantly a thorn in Israel's side because they wanted to wipe them out. But God said, Jonah, I want you to go and preach to these people. I want you to preach repentance to them so that they may turn to me. And what does Jonah do? He says, I ain't doing this. I can't stand these people. He said, I would rather you just rain down fire on them. So he flees and goes to Tarshish on a boat. But then the storm comes. The people on the boat, come to realize that someone has angered their God. And Jonah admits to it, fesses up. They throw him overboard. He's swallowed by a big fish. He is in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights before he's spit out after he prays repentance. And then goes to Nineveh. He goes and preaches, and the people turn to God. And here we are in chapter 4. That was the first 3 chapters, very briefly. And now here we are in chapter 4. We're going to pick up in verses 1 through 4. And it says, but it displeased Jonah exceedingly, the fact that the people had turned to God in chapter 3. He says, that displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. And he prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish. For I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. And the Lord said, do you do well to be angry? Well, let me tell you something. Have you ever been so upset with God that you have just decided that it's just better for you to die than to live? I mean, think about how extreme that is. That may sound silly to us now, but when you think about it, Jonah is so upset and so angry. I mean, it literally says he was exceedingly displeased and so angry. He prays and says, God, I knew you were going to do this. Isn't this what I told you would happen? Because I know you're so gracious. I know you're so loving. And he says, just take me out. I can't handle this. What? I mean, think about that for a minute. We're going to look later on, but there were, and it's going to detail this later, there were over 120,000 people in this city. And the king, the leader of the nation, and the people, they saw their wicked ways. They understood the wrong that they had done, and they turned from their wicked ways and repented and turned to God for salvation. And in verse 10 of chapter 3, it says, when God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he had said he would do to them, and he did not do it. Why? Because when a repentant heart comes to God, he welcomes them with an open arm, regardless of who they are. But Jonah really reveals his selfishness here. His contempt with God is so high. I mean, look at this. How many times it says in here? It says, he prayed to the Lord. He said, isn't this what I said while I was in my country? That's why I fled. I knew, he says, take my life from me, for it's better for me. There's a lot of me and a lot of I in these 4 verses because he's only focused on himself. He's only focused on his own way. He saw these people that hated him. Before he came to their country, they hated him. They hated him and his people. They had even killed his people. Jonah didn't want anything to do with them. Think about that in your life. Are there people that in your life that you don't want anything to do with? Because listen, there are people in my life that I don't want anything to do with. There are people that I don't even know who blaspheme the name of God, and I'm like, you're getting yours on Judgment Day, and you deserve it. And as true as that may be, they also deserve grace I shouldn't say they deserve it because none of us deserve it. But if they sought grace, if they sought compassion, God would give it to them. If they sincerely turned their heart to God, God would give them that salvation. And who am I to sit back and be angry at God for working a miracle? Who am I to sit back and be angry at the way God works in other people's lives? Because sometimes we get to a point where we see God working miracles in other people's lives. We see God working in ways that should be praised. We see people who turn to God when they have hated him for all their life. And then we have this contempt in our heart. We have this hatred where we look at God and say, well, they deserve the fiery hell punishment that you've set aside for sinners. They're heathens. They should be destroyed and annihilated. But let me ask you this. What if God had that same thought about you or me? When I say to other people, man, I can't wait to see how you turn out on Judgment Day, what if God had the same thought about me? What if he looked at us and said, you know what, you truly don't deserve grace, and we don't. It's a gift that only he can give. We shouldn't have this contempt for other people. We shouldn't have this, disdain when God works in other people's lives when we don't feel like they're deserving of it. We should be happy. We should be joyful. Jonah should have had the attitude of, God, thank you for, one, allowing me to witness this miracle. God, thank you for turning 120,000 souls to you. Ironically, think about this to what we talked about last week. When Jonah was in the belly of the fish, his prayer was a whole lot different than this one right here. You see, when Jonah prayed in the belly of the fish, he was very grateful for God's grace, wasn't he? He was very grateful for God's grace and God's mercy when it came to him. But when God's grace and mercy fell on other people, he was like, why would you be good to my enemies? Why would you be good to the people that hate you, Lord? That's what he was saying. In chapter 2, the prayer from the belly of the fish was so much different. It's all about God in that prayer. He talks about all that the Lord has done to be merciful, all the grace that he has given. And even in verse 9, he says, but I with the voice of and this is in chapter 2, verse 9, he says, but I with the voice of thanksgiving will sacrifice to you, Lord. What I have vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. So in chapter 2, he believed that. He believed in mercy. He believed in grace. He believed in God's salvation. But in chapter 4, that prayer all of a sudden turns so selfish. And that's why Jonah it's such an interesting book, and sometimes it's got a lot of sad parts in it, like this right here. At one point, Jonah prayed that God would save his life. But now in chapter 4, what's interesting is Jonah prayed that God would take his life. We are not called to be so wishy-washy and back and forth. And what's interesting, is God answers with a very simple question. Do you do well to be angry? Or basically, he says, is it right for you to be angry? Should you be angry about this, Jonah? And Jonah's going to answer that question in just a moment. But we're going to see that Jonah didn't give a response this first time. Why? Because there was no response needed. His anger was unjust. His anger was inappropriate. Jonah had such a callous heart that God had saved the lives of other people. And think about a time where, have you ever had a situation where you had such a callous heart at the way God worked in other people's lives? We should be joyful. We should be happy that God is alive and working in other people's lives. Why? Because this life is not about us. Believe it or not, if we were to find the center of our solar system, which is very easy to find when you think about it, because it's the sun, but some people think that the earth revolves around them. That's not how it works. If we looked at our galaxy, we are not the center of it. Our solar system is not in the center of the galaxy. In fact, that's the most dangerous place to be, is there in the center. We revolve around what God created. It's all about Him. It's all about what He has done. We are not the center of it. We are not the focal point. Sometimes we have such a desire for God to destroy evil. It's like we want God to destroy evil. We don't want the people that hate God to be rewarded. We want them to be punished. But here's the thing. If God all of a sudden decided to eliminate evil, what would you say if He said He was going to start with you first? Because there is no one righteous, not even one, for all have fallen short of the glory of God, and all have fallen short of His glorious standard. If God were to eliminate evil first and foremost, He might start with you. That's why we need to have this attitude of being thankful for God's mercy and God's grace, that He doesn't just annihilate us, and that He doesn't just annihilate the people who harm Him or, say bad things about Him on this earth, in this life, or who constantly go against Him and blaspheme His name. We should be thankful that they still have an opportunity to turn to Him. And we should be motivating them toward God rather than giving them this resentment. But we're going to look more at Jonah's anger in verses 5 through 9. It says, Jonah went out of the city and sat to the east of the city and made a booth for himself there. He sat under it in the shade till he should see what would become of the city. Now the Lord God appointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be a shade over his head, to save him from his discomfort. So Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the plant. But when dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on the head of Jonah so that he was faint. And he asked that he might die, and said, It is better for me to die than to live. But God said to Jonah, Do you do well to be angry for the plant? And he said, Yes, I do well to be angry enough to die. Poor Jonah. And I tell you what, he leaves the city after God asks him, Do you do well to be angry? He didn't answer, but you know what he does? He says, I'm out of here. He goes out to the east of the city, makes his own little shelter, and sits in the shade, because you know what he's expecting? He's expecting God to change his mind and say, God cannot be serious that He's going to save these people. So he goes out to the edge of the city and turns his back to look at it, expecting fire to come down, just like it did in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah, so that the city could be destroyed. That's what he's thinking. That's what he's wanting to see. And even though he was so full of that rage that God had saved these people, look what God does. While Jonah didn't care for the well-being of the Assyrians, he did demonstrate, concern for his own comfort. He makes his own shelter. God knew it wasn't sufficient. And isn't that something that God knows that we have no ability in our own to sufficiently sustain ourselves? And that's why He sent Christ to die on the cross, that we might be saved from our sins, that He might be that sufficient sacrifice for us. So Jonah makes him a shelter, God knew it wasn't sufficient. So it says he appointed a plant that it might grow to be shade over his head to save him from his discomfort, because he knew he was discomforted. And when dawn came up, or before that, Jonah was so excited because of the plant, because he had the shade. Think about it, here in South Carolina, it gets hot during the summer. Now we're at that point where you run your heat in the morning in the car and your AC in the afternoon. Just how it is. But imagine sitting out in the desert, if you will. Nothing around you but maybe sand, rocks, maybe a few cactus, a little tumbleweed, blowing around somewhere. Maybe some mountains in the background, or those rock figures, that you see in Arizona or at the Grand Canyon, or out in Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, in those areas. You think about just a desert wilderness, hot, really hot, very, very hot, sweaty, just not for me, y'all. I'll take the air conditioning any day. So when you get a little bit of shade, it feels good. So what does Jonah do? He gets excited, he gets glad, he's thankful. But what happens when the plant dies? Jonah all of a sudden changes his attitude and says, God, just kill me. I can't handle this. He can't handle the heat. The shade provided what's interesting is that the shade from the plant did something that nothing else in the story could do for Jonah. Notice what it says. Because of the plant, Jonah was exceedingly glad. There it says in verse 6. That's the first time you see in this story that Jonah was actually joyful. Truly and exceedingly joyful. All because of the shade of the plant. Marks the first time he was happy this whole time. But we get to a point where that shade is taken away. And God says, do you do well to be angry for the plant? And he said, yes, I do well enough to be angry, even to die. And it's interesting, because he's not happy about the people that repented. He was happy about the plant and the shade that he got. And he says, Jonah, do you do well to be angry for a plant? Do you do well to be angry about the little things? Is what God is asking. Do you do well to be angry over the little itty-bitty things? And that's a question that maybe God is asking to all of us. Do we do well to let our anger overwhelm and rule us? Do we allow our anger to take away from the mission that God has given to us? Do we allow our anger to get in the way of our worship? Do we show up to church so angry at what's happened already in the day? Maybe we were cut off in traffic, or the dogs just weren't cooperating. Larson and Diva always cooperate. Sometimes little things like that make you very frustrated and can make you very angry. Do you let that anger get in the way of your worship? Do you let that anger get in the way of what God is doing in your life and other people's lives? And that's what God is asking Jonah. He says, Jonah, are you letting your anger get in the way because of all these little things? And that's why he says, do you do well to be angry? And sometimes we just throw up our hands like Jonah and say, yes, just angry enough. I'm tired of it. But listen to how God responds with compassion. In verses 10 and 11, he says, and the Lord said, you pity the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. Should I not pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle? He says, Jonah, you had all this concern. He says, you pity the plant, which, by the way, that you did not labor for, that you did not come into being. He says, you pitied over something that appeared in a night and perished in a night. He said, you were so angry and so worried about the temporal things. You were so angry about the temporary, and you missed the big picture. You missed the big picture planning, because God says, Should I not care more about the great city of Nineveh, which had more than 120,000 people? But he goes on to say, not only were there just that many people, but he said people who could not distinguish between their right and their left. God was saying, you pitied over the plant. Should I not pity people who don't know about me? He said, these people, they didn't know their right from their left. And basically what he was saying is, they didn't have a moral guide. He said, they were just doing whatever they pleased. He said, they were lost. And God, this is the message that God's trying to get to Jonah, but also to us. When we see other people who, like Wade has said before many times in his sermons, why do we get surprised when lost people act like lost people? We shouldn't be surprised at that because, like Wade has said, lost people act like lost people. That's just how they are because they don't know any better. And that's why it's our responsibility to bring this knowledge to them, to bring salvation to them through preaching, through Bible school, through Sunday school, through sharing the gospel of Christ. And that's why God says, should I not pity them more than this plant? They don't know. They don't have a guide. As Jesus spoke to the children of Israel, he tells his disciples, he says, these people are like sheep without a shepherd. They don't know. They're lost. They don't have anyone to guide them. They don't have anyone to help them. They don't have anyone to lead them. And that's why God's telling Jonah, this is why I brought salvation to them. They didn't know. They had no idea. And God says, that's why I sent you, Jonah. I sent you there to preach salvation. And they turned to me. God is telling Jonah. He says, we should be celebrating that. But instead, Jonah's eyes were on the temporary. He didn't work for that plant. He didn't plant it. He didn't water it. He didn't tend to it. It was a gift of God's grace. Jonah cared more about that plant than he did the people of Nineveh. He cared so much more about that plant than people who were created in the image of God. And think about that in your life. Do you care more about the temporary things, or do you care more about the eternal things made in the image of God? The souls of other people, the souls of those who are lost. Do you care more about this temporary life, or are you focused heavenward? That's what God was trying to get in Jonah's head, and that's the message that he's trying to get to us. This story of Jonah, it ends abruptly, just like this, boom, it's done. Why? Because now maybe it's up to us to carry the story. Now maybe it's our turn to respond and say, you know what, God, you're right. I'm going to throw away the temporary. I'm not going to focus on the temporary. I'm going to focus on the heavenly things. I'm going to focus heavenward. I'm not going to let the temporary things hold me back. I'm not going to let my anger over that which is temporary hold me back. I'm going to focus on you. I'm going to give myself to you and surrender to you so that I can be a shepherd to other people. Because that's what God has called us to be. The story of Jonah is a reminder to all of us. We are called to be shepherds. And when we see God work, we should celebrate it. We shouldn't be jealous at the way God is working in other people's lives and not ours, because that's not the point of it. The point is that God is working and God is alive and real. And if that's true, and there's good evidence to suggest that it is, then we should be exceedingly glad because He has a promise for us that if we will trust in Him, and for those of us that have already trusted Him, we have a forever future of salvation with Him. So let Him work however He wants to, because guess what? You are secured by His grace for those who believe in Him and trust in Him and trust in the power of the blood. Then you are already held close to Him. So be excited and be glad for how others are seeing God work in their life. Be joyful. Encourage them. Don't let the temporary things hold you back. Don't have that anger just out of spite, like those rivalries we talked about earlier, when it's just like you just can't stand, you just love to see that other team lose because you can't stand them. Don't have that thought about other people especially. We love God by loving others. We love God by loving others. Jesus even says, that other people will be able to identify us by our love for them. So go out and be loving. Don't let anger and selfishness be a distraction for other people. Be graceful just like God has been graceful to you. Ask yourself. Or actually, just imagine God asking you this every time you get angry. Do you do well to be angry? Just as he said to Jonah. Is it right for you to be angry? Is it right for you to be angry? Do you do well to be angry? No, you don't. None of us do. It gets us nowhere. So be loving, be graceful, and be merciful. Y'all, thank you for tuning in to our Sunday school class this week. I wish you all a very blessed week. Go Cardinals! Remember that. Thank y'all. Have a good week.
So if you have a need or a concern or want to discuss your relationship with Jesus, please feel free to call us at 864-288-7835 or contact us on the website at maldenfirstbaptist.org.
This has been a video presentation of Malden First Baptist Church, Malden, South Carolina.